Hi everyone. Welcome to AP Review slideshow. I couldn't do it in person this year, so just gonna give some quick fast facts what I would have presented if I was in person. So these are just kind of some last minute reminders about the AP, some content from units 7 through 9. So this is the last time period of AP World, 1900 to the present. You probably wouldn't get a DBQ. That's a probably. Um, but LEQ is fair game, and some multiple choice questions are fair too. Well, I'm not sure if they're fair, but just a warning. So of course, kind of if you've been going to all the other ones, get your challenge token. No, there's no challenge token. So these are the course themes right here, and I kind of go through them one by one. What pieces of evidence could you use to support these ideas? All right, first one, humans and the environment, disease. Really, there's only one unit topic about humans and the environment in period 4, and it's mostly about the effects of globalization on the environment. A connection to another time period, globalization, this diffusion of trade, it leads to disease spreading. And here are some examples of disease in the 20th and 21st century. Spanish flu after World War I, HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, and then you could even use a modern example like COVID. That's all of these are epidemic diseases that will spread largely because of globalization. But another related topic is health. Tech advancement is going to lead to longer life. Penicillin, that's a 20th century development because there was a multiple choice question about that on your one of your quizzes most recently. Vaccines are also improving lifespans, blood transfusions, any of these medical advancements are leading to longer life expectancies. Something the AP wants you to know about, though, is that there are diseases associated with poverty and diseases associated with longevity, with people living a long time. So diseases in poor living conditions like malaria, Ebola, and then conditions that have to do with people living longer. Cancer, Alzheimer's, these things tend to be associated more with older people around the world, and people are living longer thanks to advancements in medicine. In terms of the environment, well, deforestation is kind of a continuity with our last time period, because as countries are industrializing, like Russia, like China, these places are also going to experience similar devastations to their environment, deforestation, and of course, increased greenhouse gas emissions. These things are going to increase mostly because of the expansion of industry in the 20th century. People are also using petroleum on a consumer level, oil on a consumer level, cars, for example. And then, of course, airplanes. All of these things require petroleum, plastic too, even. Generally, kind of on the AP, you might get like a graph, basically, and it could be like carbon emissions going up, and then the answer is globalization, typically. Another thing about the environment is the Green Revolution. You learned about this in Human Geo last year. So luckily, some of you already know about it. But essentially, it is this revitalization of agriculture using pesticides, using improved synthetic fertilizers. And while that is good in a sense, it does lead to more people being alive because more food means more people. We do see that that is kind of a bad impact on the environment in a way. Pesticides and increased demand for land is going to lead to deforestation in places like Brazil, for example. But in reaction to all of this, well, there will be movements for environmentalism, Greenpeace being the example the AP gives. And of course, urbanization is a related trend. So all of these things are a continuity with the last time period. The change, however, is that it just increases so much more rapidly. All right, culture. According to the AP, actually, kind of one of the cultural developments they would want you to know about is this idea of nationalism during wartime, government promotion of nationalism during catastrophic worldwide events like World War I and World War II. So understanding kind of this definition of total war, that does include nationalist propaganda. Propaganda is one way governments are trying to organize culture, trying to make national identity. And of course, we also do see as democracies expand, public opinion actually matters. So oftentimes governments try and shape cultural values to support political systems. And that's true not only in totalitarian societies, in communist and fascist states like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, but also in democratic countries as well during wars like World War I, like World War II. Totalitarianism that generally describes communist states like the Soviet Union, like China, like Vietnam, North Korea, etc. But it could also describe fascist countries as well, like Spain, Italy, Germany, even Japan as well. So totalitarianism is having more government presence in culture and total control over society and the economy as well. And nationalism obviously is a big cause of both the First and Second World War. Related to all of this is new intellectual developments in terms of government. Communism, while it was developed during the 19th century, during the Industrial Revolution, we don't actually see a communist revolution until the Russian Revolution, until 1917. And communism is really going to not spread outside of the Soviet Union until after World War II. But we do see it as a major political force, especially after the Second World War during the Cold War. Communism, the AP wants you to understand, contains this idea of a planned economy, of government control over the economy, the 5-year plans in Russia, the Great Leap Forward in China. But also, communism, also, at least in these countries, also has this attempt to build up nationalism, especially during the Cold War. The Soviet Union had anti-American nationalism, and so did the United States. But of course, the United States, not a communist country. Hello, little child. There's a not a child. I'm not petting a child right now. All right. So really, we don't see any communist societies until the Soviet Union in 1917. The Russian Revolution is probably the most important you would need to know for the AP. But in terms of another new ideology, we also have fascism. Fascism is an authoritarian right-wing ideology. It stresses racial hierarchy and ideas of race being important in society. And of course, it is going to be a very totalitarian form of government. Complete control over society, political freedom is suspended. Not a great place to live, I suppose. Or not, I suppose, obviously, it's not a great place to live. Nazi Germany and fascist Italy being the two best examples. However, really, after World War II, we do see movements for change. And these are just a list of different movements for change. And you could get an LEQ about this. That's why I bring it up. Military sizes generally increase. That's a cause for a lot of these movements for change. It's a reaction against militarism and authoritarian governments. It's against racism as well. And there's examples right here. The protests against the Vietnam War in the 1960s. Prague Spring. This was a protest against the communist government of Czechoslovakia, in which we saw student protests against authoritarianism. We have the civil rights movements as well. MLK in the United States, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, both of these people using civil disobedience. And that's kind of one term the AP would want you to know. Basically, it's disobeying unjust laws peacefully. And yet, despite the fact we do see movements for change that are civil disobedient, that are peaceful, nonviolent, we do see examples of terrorism as well. The Shining Path in Peru, this is a communist terrorist group that wants to overthrow that government in Peru. Al-Qaeda is an example the AP wants you to know about, overthrowing pro-Western governments in the Middle East, doing terrorist attacks against American civilians, and also the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization in Palestine. So a really big pushback against imperialism or perceived imperialism, to be politically neutral, in this environment. All right, another thing about culture is going to be this idea of diffusion of culture. Globalization leads to diffusion of everything under the sun, including global culture. So we do see that there is going to be this emerging demand for consumer products around the world. And this does lead to kind of big multinational corporations really exporting the culture that they are originally from. So big American companies, for example, like Disney, becoming kind of a major global cultural producer. So global brands are going to lead to kind of more globalized culture. and multinational corporations as well that export culture. Kind of culture is a new export, if you will. People are buying popular media, films, DVDs, iTunes gift cards, I don't know. But in terms of what is allowing for this technology, radios in the early 20th century, movies by the 1920s, TV by the 50s, internet by the present day. However, despite this kind of positive thing that we are a more connected international society, that culture is spreading, for example, from Japan to the United States. We also do see this accusation that stronger, economically powerful countries like the United States are intentionally destroying the native cultures of people around the world, in South America, for example. And we call this term Coca-Colonization. It's a pretty funny term, but it basically means that the US is using its economic influence to undermine the independence of a country's culture. So it is going to be this criticism that globalization is drowning out individual global cultures. Language is dying out because of the widespread use of English, for example. However, kind of in reaction to this globalization, we do see nationalist movements, anti-globalist movements. So this could be kind of this idea of reclaiming your culture, but it could also be separating, isolating from mainstream society. Hello, other child. Yes, you are a kitty cat. All right, governance. First thing you'd need to know about is revolutions. There are a bunch of revolutions that happen. And the main thing that's significant about this is that it leads to the end of land-based empires, especially in the early 20th century. The Young Turk Revolution, for example, in the Ottoman Empire is going to lead to the end of the Ottoman Empire. And typically these revolutions happen because of political and economic problems. The Chinese Revolution in 1911 leads to the end of the Qing dynasty. The Russian Revolution leads the end of the Russian Empire. And even in countries that aren't land-based empires, like Mexico, for example, we do see revolutions to bring about economic equality. So typically all of these revolutions, especially the Mexican, Chinese, and Russian ones, are influenced by nationalism, make a nation stronger by limiting foreign presence in your country, but also by reforming land ownership. So that typically is what unites all three of these revolutions, is this common concern with nationalism, land equality, and ending economic imperialism. All right, global conflict, the two big conflicts you would need to know about: World War I, World War II. World War I, it's easy: Maine, militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. World War II, it's a bit more complicated. Basically, the cause of World War II is World War I. People are mad at the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler, for example, Italy and Japan feel that they didn't get the land they deserved from that war. Countries like Italy, Germany, and Japan militarize very heavily, using government control over the economy to redirect focus to military production. And these kind of countries form the Axis. They're the bad guys in World War II. And, you shouldn't obviously look at history in terms of good and bad, but it's pretty easy with World War II. But kind of the AP, what it wants you to understand is this demand for natural resources is the major reason why World War II happened. Germany wanted Lebensraum, living space for Germans. They wanted oil from the Soviet Union. And Japan wanted everything it could get from East Asian societies. All right. After World War I, we see a lot of continuity and change. The continuity is that colonies are still around. World War I was fought over imperialism, and that led to countries basically getting what they wanted from Africa and Asia. The change is that some countries get new territories in the mandate system, and Japan also is gaining more land in China. There are increased independence movements after World War I, and these are some examples right there: Ataturk in the Middle East, Gandhi in India, etc. Global politics after World War II, the big thing: the UN, the United Nations, international organizations for peace. Another big shift after World War II is that Western Europe is no longer the dominant power that it was during the age of imperialism. Instead, it's the Soviets and the Americans. That's the Cold War summed up. The Cold War, it was primarily caused over ideological hostility to communism and capitalism, respectively. And we do see that kind of new alliances will form: NATO, the Warsaw Pact for the Soviets. And of course, these countries, the Soviet Union and the United States, are competing for influence in Africa and Asia via proxy wars. The Soviets back communists, the Americans back anyone who's not a communist, including fascists. But that's besides the point. Non-aligned movement, we do see that countries will say, we don't want the influence of either the Soviets or Americans. So we do see that non-aligned countries like India, like Indonesia, these countries will try to stay independent during the Cold War. And to help with this, we do see the emergence of what we call transnational ideologies. These are basically, let's unify as a ethnicity, as a common culture against the West, against Americans, against the Soviets, and Africanism in Africa and Arabism in the Middle East. Decolonization. What's the biggest cause of decolonization? You guessed it, nationalism. But also, of course, there are countries trying to end economic imperialism through economic nationalism. There are different armed struggles against colonization around the world in Vietnam, Angola, Algeria. But some countries do get their independence through civil disobedience. Gandhi in India, Ghana with Kwame Nkrumah, and in French West Africa too. But generally some problems after independence: ethnic divisions. In India, there's conflict between Hindus and Muslims. In Rwanda, between the Hutu and the Tutsi. And kind of a result of this is going to be the migration of people. People are fleeing violence, and people are relocating to countries that are more closely connected to their ethnic background. But even after independence, of course, there are some movements for greater autonomy for special regions. For example, the Irish, the Northern Irish, I should say, the IRA is going to form as a terrorist organization to fight against the British presence in Northern Ireland. And you don't need to know about the Quebecois, or however you say that in French, in Canada. Basically, they want an independent Quebec. But a new kind of trend is that there will be states that form after colonization ends. And that is going to lead to a lot of conflict, especially over the disputes over how borders were drawn. The Mandate of Palestine, for example, becomes Israel. Palestine wasn't granted its independence like it was promised in World War I, but that is going to result in a lot of conflict in the Middle East. Israel is viewed as an illegitimate country because it was created without the consent of local Palestinian Arabs. India becomes India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and we saw the violence there when we discussed decolonization during our class. Indonesia, or I should say Indochina, that's going to lead to Vietnam and Cambodia forming, and that does lead to a lot of ethnic violence in Cambodia, especially. And the Cold War, these are the three reasons why the Cold War ended: glasnost and perestroika, economic liberalization, basically, the arms race popping up again, and the failed Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. All of these things lead to the end of the Soviet Union, which means that's the end of the Cold War. You are not going to get a question about after the Cold War, I almost guarantee you, in terms of politics, but we do see that some general trends. Countries around the world tend to be more capitalist, tend to be more economically liberal, and we do see that contributes to globalization. But the new concern after the Cold War is going to be terrorism. Economic systems. Generally, we do see that as the 20th century wears on, governments become more involved in the economy. And that's generally because of responses to crises. During World War I and World War II, we saw that governments engaged in total war. They engaged in that practice of controlling the economy to support the war efforts. However, one of the biggest economic crises in which we see more government presence is going to be the Great Depression. Before the Great Depression, we really saw this return to laissez-faire economics, hands-off economics. But with the Great Depression, we see more government attempts to regulate the economy. We see this in democratic countries. In the US, the New Deal, social welfare, Keynesian economics to maximize employment. But in places like Germany, in places like Italy, Italy, Brazil, Argentina, we see this rise of fascism. Fascism is a response to economic crises in a way. And we see this emergence of something called corporatism. Basically, the government is going to step in to protect big business and negotiate with labor unions. Kind of the government is in control of the economy, tells the corporations what they should produce, but day-to-day administration left to private individuals. And of course, kind of the intent behind this system is to militarize and build up infrastructure. The Soviet Union is a good example of economic systems during the 20th century. The NEP, the New Economic Policy, initially designed to introduce a little bit of capitalism into the Soviet Union. Eventually, that's scrapped for the 5-year plans. This is what leads to industrialization in the Soviet Union. It makes the Soviet Union a planned economy. And there are positives from this. Women are working equal to men, but of course, we do see political repression as well. In terms of China, that's kind of one of the big areas you would need to know for the AP. The main attempt to industrialize China is through the Great Leap Forward. Basically, Mao is going to repeat what Stalin did in the Soviet Union. And there's a degree of success in a way that we do see government control over the economy. That part is successful. But we do see that it doesn't have the same industrial impact as the Soviet Union until later reforms are made. Collectivization, that's basically when small farms become big farm, government ownership of the farms. Political control in China led to the Cultural Revolution, basically kind of, I don't want to say indoctrinating Chinese youth, but making Chinese youth kind of more receptive to Mao's communist teachings. And generally, we do see kind of during the Cold War, this spread of socialist and economic nationalist ideas in the non-aligned world, especially, mainly to end that system of economic imperialism, having foreign countries own significant tracts of land in an independent nation. And there are a lot of different countries that try and do land reform in Latin America. Cuba is a good example of a communist society doing that. Vietnam getting their independence through a communist revolution. And in Egypt, we have Gamal Nasser. Nasser will nationalize the Suez Canal. The continuity during this time is migration. People are mostly moving for economic reasons. Economic reasons for employment, especially in Western countries. With Latin Americans going to the United States, with people in India going mostly to Britain, actually. So typically, these people migrating, they tend to come from former colonies going to their former colonial powers. South Asians like Indians and Pakistanis going to the UK. We also see guest workers. These are people that are basically kind of hired as a temporary work to solve any work shortages. And that tends to happen after World War II. That's how Western Europe rebuilds after World War II. By the time of the end of the Cold War, we see a transition away from government control to laissez-faire and free market politics. Reagan and Pinochet and Thatcher, those are all examples in the West. Thatcher, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Augusto Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, Reagan, the president, of the United States. Deng Xiaoping, good example in China. He's going to introduce free market reforms into China and kind of move away from Mao's government control. After the Cold War, the trend tends to be this transition away from industry in the West towards knowledge economies, towards economies focused on research and development, on high educated workforce. Whereas in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, these places tend to have their own industrial boom, but they also see a continuity in raw material extraction. A thing that helps out with free trade is going to be the creation of free trade agreements. And that is going to basically reduce regulations on trade between member countries. NAFTA is a good example in North America, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the WTO, the World Trade Organization. All right, in terms of social interactions around the world, this is the second to last slide. We see an increasing concern, especially during this time of nationalism and total war. We see, of course, genocide and other mass atrocities being committed. We see that these mass atrocities, a lot of the causes tend to be those totalitarian ideologies like fascism. These ideas of social Darwinism also help justify that. That's a continuity from the last unit. However, we do kind of see that that is going to have a big consequence of motivating people to reflect on these genocides and say, maybe we shouldn't do that. Maybe we should have movements for social justice. And a good example of that is the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Movements for change include kind of solving economic inequality in places like Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And kind of the biggest way that that is attempted is through land reform. Break up these big landed estates, give them to peasants. And we see actually that take place in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution, but we also see it in India as well, although it won't be successful in the long term for in both of these countries. Liberation theology is another kind of economic response or cultural response to economic inequalities. Basically, let's combine Catholicism with social justice. Of course, movements to change social hierarchies like racism and gender hierarchies, those will kind of emerge as well after the Second World War. Civil rights movements for the LGBT plus community, second wave feminism, which is basically concerned with social equality and cultural equality for women. Third wave feminism, more focused on people of color and LGBTQ plus individuals, but also, of course, movements for people of color, like with Martin Luther King in the United States, Nelson Mandela in South Africa. And increasingly, the trend for women is that there is more rights in the international community. That's the trend at the very latest, at the very least, global feminism. And that is going to be best expressed in a few things. Suffrage is generally granted to women around the world, but also a UN commitment to gender equality as well in the Declaration of Human Rights. All right, last thing, military technology, or technology, I should say. In terms of military technology, you don't need to know specifics. This could be an LEQ though. So trench warfare, barbed wire, machine gun, tanks, planes, that's World War I. World War II, nuclear bombs, radar. Cold War, nuclear bombs, rockets, the space race. In terms of communication, well, this helps out with globalization, but telephone, radio, film, TV, internet, you all know what these things are. Transportation, we see that people are able to move their products thanks to better air travel, thanks to shipping containers. Agricultural developments, pesticides, insecticides, GMOs, chemical fertilizers. That's the green revolution. In terms of healthcare, vaccines, polio vaccines, really important one. Penicillin is a really important one that prevents infections. Birth control and fertility care also will lead to more social freedom for women as well, for people that use birth control. Energy is a new development, at least in our widespread use of petroleum, but also we use atomic energy as well. But the downside of these things is that that will lead to increased production and consumption, and that also leads to more greenhouse gases. All right, so sorry I couldn't be there today, but have a wonderful, wonderful day. Finger guns and end.